Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for the webinar today. My name is Ben Hutchins and I'm part of the marketing team here at Autodesk Innovise. Today we are focusing on how we can improve river health 2022 and beyond. If you have any questions as we run through the slides today, please type them into the question box located in the right corner of your GoToWebinar interface. We won't mention your full name when reading your questions, and our experts will provide answers. Please note that all phone lines are muted during the webinar today. Now let me introduce you to your experts. Firstly, we are delighted to be joined by Joe Bradley, Operations Director at Stormwater Shepherds. Joe has worked in the field of pollution prevention for over 30 years and is passionate about getting the water quality elements of Suds design right. She enjoys looking for opportunities to deliver water treatment devices into Suds management trains that both prevent pollution and allow the ponds and wetlands to become excellent habitats for nature. Joe joined Stormwater Shepherds in September 2020 and is intent on reducing plastic pollution, both from plastic litter in towns and cities and from microplastic tyre wear particles in road runoff. Joining Joe is Daniel Johns. Daniel is Managing Director at Water Resources East, the independent, non-for-profit membership organisation overseeing the management of scarce water resources for all sectors and the environment in Eastern England. Daniel joined WRE in January after 3 years at Anglian Water. He was previously a senior civil servant at the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs and head of adoption at the Climate Change Committee. Next we have Mark Lloyd. Mark is Chief Executive Officer at the Rivers Trust. He is responsible for overseeing direction and strategy. He joined the Rivers Trust in 2019 after 10 years as Chief Executive of the Angling Trust and Fish Legal, where he played a transformational role representing the UK's 3 million anglers and taking legal action against polluters. Much of that work was focused on protecting water quality, a subject close to Mark's heart. Prior to that, Mark was Chief Executive of Thames 21, one of the River Trust's current members. He therefore is deeply familiar with the culture, challenges and opportunities of the River Trust movement. We're also pleased to welcome Paul Campbell, Solutions Engineer at Autodesk Innovise. Paul studied as a mechanical engineer and as part of his degree did a year in the industry, working as a water distribution network modeler. He enjoyed it so much he joined the water industry in 2003 as a wastewater network modeler and has been working as a hydraulic modeling consultant ever since. Paul joined the Autodesk Innovise Solution Engineering team in 2020, specialising in storm, sewer and flood modeling. Finally, your host today is Peter Coombs. Peter is Innovation Manager at Autodesk Innovise. He's a chartered water and environment manager with over 45 years experience. Peter has designed, modelled and delivered a range of storm and foul water networks in the UK before moving to the Middle East for 5 years. For the past 20 years, Peter has been with the Innovise Group, specialising in Suds, floods, asset management and AI across the EMEA region. That completes our expert lineup for you today, so let's start the show. Peter, over to you.
Perfect. Thank you, Ben, and welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us. And I'm hoping that today we're really going to be able to sort of showcase all the fantastic work that these like non-profits and charities are engaging with to help clean up our rivers across the country. So Ben mentioned the word passion earlier. I bet Joe's passionate about these things, Daniel's passionate, Mark's passionate, and I thought, well, I'll just share this on a personal level. Here are my passions, and this is what really makes Peter Coombs tick, and this is what I love to do. And increasingly, as time goes by, I can see adverse effects. I'd like to leave this planet with a very light footprint and to have cleaned up the environment to put it into a better position than it was when I first arrived quite a long time ago. But at the minute, I feel as though my footprint is really, really heavy. So what I've done, I've joined Joe with Stormwater Shepherds, where we're really taking action with litter picks, we're monitoring water qualities on river catchments and doing a whole range of awareness and educational things such as this together. So this is a pleasure to be participating. And during that sort of journey, what's happened is I came across the Bristol and Avon Rivers Trust. So Mark's the CEO of the Rivers Trust across the whole country. And then I came across my local area. So just to put that into context, here's the River Severn coming down to the Bristol Channel. So we have Bristol and Bath here, M4 motorway, M5 motorway, and the little red dot is where I am. And the Bristol and Avon Rivers Trust is the catchment upstream of the River Avon, which feeds into the Bristol Portway and then feeds into the Bristol Channel. And what the Rivers Trust do every year, they do what's called a water blitz. So I heard about it only this last year in 2021, and I volunteered and was provided with the kit by the Bristol and Avon Rivers Trust. I took a look on the website, and just to orientate yourselves on the plan here, the larger plan, the source of the River Frome is in Doddington. This is where James Dyson lives, by the way, the vacuum guy. And these lakes and ponds were put in by Capability Brown, and there's a manor house, and that's what he owns. And this is the source of the River Frome, and the source is sort of fed by runoff from the A46 road, and then that's the source of the River Frome. It comes down through like pasture land, really, and then hits Chipping Sodbury, runs through Chipping Sodbury, my hometown of Yate. To the western side, there's industrial area, here's the railway station, and then it runs through to the confluence with the Laden Brook, and then that becomes a slightly larger river, feeds down through Frampton Cotterell and down into the north part of Bristol, Eastville in Bristol, and then into the Portway. Now, this is showing us where the CSOs, where the combined sewer overflows are in Frampton Cotterell. So what I did in July, I thought, well, what I'll do is I'll take samples upstream of the town of Chipping Sodbury and Yate, downstream of the industrial area of Yate, and then at the downstream end of the River Frome, but ahead of the confluence, and then downstream of the CSOs. And I did another downstream sample because there's some farmland here, and I noticed that there was a new ditch, and then there was a pipe that was discharging something into the river. So I thought I'd do another sample check there. So as I mentioned, we're provided with the kit by the Rivers Trust. Thank you, Mark and the team, George and Rosie and the team there at the Bristol and Avon Rivers Trust. So they provide you with all the kit and the charts and all the instructions on how to do this. Anyone can do it as a citizen scientist, and there are over 160 odd people out in that catchment this weekend taking samples. You log it on the Freshwater Watch app, so you got the GPS location, and then the results get fed in, and then that's all accessible by the Rivers Trust, and they can develop a map across the whole of the UK. What did I find? Well, upstream of the CSOs, everything was in a good ecological status, and that really kind of quite surprised me, to be honest with you, because, and here are pictures of the river. I thought that it might deteriorate as the water went through the towns, but it didn't. It was in good status. I just checked for nitrates and phosphates to put this into a context for you. But then when we come downstream of the CSOs and downstream of the farmland, it was not moderate, but down to the poor level. So that was my experience. And so my motivation there is to clean it all up and to do more regular monitoring. So as a part of the Stormwater Shepherds with Joe, what we've done is carried out some presentations, gathered some funding, bought some handheld monitors, and now I'm going out, just starting to go out every month rather than once a year. And I'll feed that back in through the Freshwater app, and then keep you posted. So that's my little story. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Mark and say, that's my experience, Mark. What's the situation across the UK with the rivers? So over to you, Mark.
Thanks very much indeed, Peter, for that, and all power to your elbow, going out and doing the work at a local scale. There's no substitute for it, I think. Yeah, as you mentioned, I'm from the Rivers Trust. Just a quick background on the Rivers Trust is that it's we're the umbrella body for really a sort of grassroots movement, we call it, for want of a better term, of about 60 Rivers Trusts with about 500 staff across the whole of the UK and Ireland, increasing sort of growth of trusts in Ireland. We have nearly complete coverage of the whole country. Quite a lot of variability, some very large trusts, some much smaller ones. But it's growing fast, and we're growing fast as an umbrella organisation, supporting that movement and trying to deal with some of the big issues at a national scale. And one of the ways we did that was to come up with this State of Our Rivers report, which I'll provide a link to at the end of the presentation, to try and sort of provide an overview of the national position, but also to provide people with data about their local river. So I've just clicked on the slide and it hasn't proceeded. Maybe we could do a next slide, please, like they do on the government announcements. So this shows a sort of overview of the country and the state of affairs. Basically, the headline is our rivers are in pretty poor shape. I'll wait for Peter, you're just moving the slides around. They've all disappeared from me. And you're on mute. I'll carry on talking anyway while they come back, hopefully.
Sorry, I'll fix it for you.
Don't worry, that's fine. So the Water Framework Directive set out an ambition to get all of our rivers into good ecological status by 2015. That hasn't happened. We've gone backwards from 21% to 14%. And the vast majority of rivers are in moderate or poor condition. That target remains to try and get 75% of rivers into good condition by 2027, but that looks very unlikely that that's going to happen. But we remain hopeful. Just see if I can progress it. Oh yes, it's working now. So the State of the Rivers report provides people with a lot more detail of how things are on their local river, based on all of the data that we can lay our hands on from both citizen scientists and from the Environment Agency. So here's an example that shows rivers that are good and then becoming moderate and poor. But it's really important, I think, for people to understand this and to understand the condition of their river and to see where things get worse, and then they can start thinking about what the causes of that are. A key element, as Peter's been testing, is nutrients. So here's a map of phosphate, and nutrients sound like a good thing, certainly a good thing for the garden, but too many of them in rivers causes severe ecological decline and the domination of blanket weed and algal blooms, and that suppresses all other life. So they really are a kind of endemic problem across the whole country. And where are those nutrients coming from? Well, farming and wastewater or sewage are the principal causes, as Peter's experience showed. Agriculture is actually more important than sewage. We've heard a lot about sewage in the news recently, but actually agriculture affects up to 60% of our water bodies, with about slightly less, about 55% affected by the water sector from sewage effluent and also sewage overflows. As we'll hear from Joe later, urban pollution is also a big problem, and probably lost in these numbers because it's not monitored as much as it should be. So it may be a larger problem than we thought. But fertilizer use, but particularly animal waste and poor storage of animal waste, is a really widespread problem. But it's much more complicated than that, and the condition of rivers is much more complicated than that. I'm often asked, are our rivers getting cleaner? And it's a really difficult question. Some of them are, some of them aren't. Some of them are cleaning up one thing, but other things are getting worse. And it's a really wicked issue. There's so many different pressures on rivers, and there's a kind of interplay here, I think, between flow, quality and habitat, and they're all interrelated. The lower the flow, the more impact there is from pollution. The lower flow, the less available area is for wildlife to be there. A lot of the organisms in rivers will process pollutants and take them out. So the condition of the habitat is very important in terms of the river's ability to sort of purify the water itself as it goes downstream. So there are all sorts of interplays between those three elements, and I think that's really important to consider, because there's a danger of kind of initiative-itis, dealing with one particular issue, which might be flavour of the month, but if you don't deal with the issue holistically, you won't actually achieve success. And just in a kind of big picture terms, we are facing, as we all know, a changing climate, and the graph there is from the Met Office showing rainfall and temperature, and it shows, for nearly 100 years, rainfall and temperature kind of wobbled around in the blue patch that you can see down the bottom left of the graph. But then from the 1970s onwards, rainfall increased considerably as temperature. So we're getting this rainfall in heavier bursts, and also the temperature is going up, which is bad for rivers because it reduces the oxygen level, and it makes pollutants more impactful. So our rivers are becoming more vulnerable as a result of the climate changes. We've also seen, obviously, huge population growth, the intensification of agriculture, and lots of new chemicals which have come on the market since the 1970s, many of which, the impact of them is unknown, and the interplay between those chemicals is very unknown, and how they all interact with each other in a kind of chemical cocktail. I've again lost control. There we go. One of those pictures is missing, but you get the picture. Agriculture, just to go back to that, I think this is the quickest and easiest and probably cheapest thing that we could fix in our environment. The spreading of slurries in particular, we've seen this terrible problems on the River Wye from the proliferation of chickens, but we have an endemic problem with too much slurry from the dairy industry. It's a very heavy product that can't be transported long distances, and it has to be spread. It's basically waste disposal on the fields. It's not used as a fertilizer, it's just getting rid of a waste product. And you can see these problems at a micro scale with that cattle feeder right next to a small stream. The bottom left, this what we call open cast sheep mining, which in Wales, where every blade of grass has gone from that field, and the picture on the right shows that's actually a maize field, but the end result is huge amounts of soil, nutrients and water running off and contributing to the problems on our rivers. Oh, there's the other picture that's appeared. That is another maize field, which really shows the sort of drastic amount of soil runoff coming out onto a roadway. So I mentioned stormwater overflows, combined sewer overflows, and treated sewage effluent, but this is a map of spills around Birmingham, and you can see the prevalence of this problem. Our sewers, cannot cope with all this additional rainfall, all the additional urbanisation, and the sheer volume of water coming down, which is combined with sewage, and so they spill out into the environment. So it really is, a huge challenge to try and deal with them. Our sewage map has been really instrumental, I think, by presenting it in this way and giving the public an understanding of the issue, and that led to a sort of huge public outcry over the last couple of years. And we had the Environment Bill, which we'll hear from later. But also some announcements this week from water companies saying that they're going to take action to reduce the number of spills very markedly. A number of companies have come forward, and we've obviously seen some targets coming forward in the 25-year environment plan as well. Flooding, a huge issue. You can see the red dots on the map don't show very clearly, but flood risk, which is not just from rivers, but also from surface water flooding. And of course, we can have too little water as well, and often the river pays the price for a shortage of supply. So, there's a prerogative for water companies to keep providing water, and it can only come from one place. I'm pleased to see a target in the 25-year environment plan for a 20% per capita reduction in water use over the next 15 years. That's going to be a challenge. We've been talking about doing this for as long as I can remember, and we, you know, the figure remains stubbornly high. But ultimately, we need to use less water and also use the water we have more intelligently, and also capture the water in the landscape rather than allowing it all to run off down into rivers and cause flooding, into sewers which cause overflows, and out to sea where it's lost for our use. This is a precious product, so we should be allowing it to soak into the ground. And I think, you know, to give you a bit of cheer amidst all this gloom, we believe that nature-based solutions present, you know, an amazing way of tackling not only the problems with our water, but also, you know, mitigating climate change, restoring biodiversity, and creating lovely amenity areas for people to enjoy and for people's mental health. So nature-based solutions could be, you know, hedges, planting trees, putting buffer zones alongside rivers to intercept nutrients and soil, building wetlands to treat wastewater and to capture water and prevent flooding. Restoring soils is probably the biggest win that we could have. If we did that over a large area, we could also capture huge amounts of carbon by doing that. Putting suds into urban areas, restoring river habitat, and, you know, all these things will purify water, they'll retain water in the landscape and reduce the load on sewers. So we think that doing all those things, you know, is really a no-brainer, but we can't ask water companies to pay for that themselves outright. But we would really like to bring people together because of those things deliver so many different objectives, to get multiple funders together because they deliver benefits to so many different sectors. So this is nearly my final slide, and it really, I think that just trying to present a framework for what we need to do in order to solve this problem at a strategic scale. And it seems to me that there's, you know, three key elements to finding a way forward to getting us out of the position that we're in. And it's a kind of three-legged stool, which means that all of the legs are important, otherwise it falls over. So the first is data, and we've seen the power of data. We need a lot more data to get a greater granularity of understanding about what's going on in our catchments. So we've launched something called the Catchment Monitoring Cooperative, which involves over 30 partners, 12 water companies, and we got £7.1 million out of Ofwat to do that. So there's a demonstration project in 8 catchments, but we want to build that into business as usual over the coming 3 years. We don't want this to be a pilot that ends and then we make the case. This is something that's going to bring together multiple sources of data, which are often unanalyzed at the moment, and sit on impenetrable spreadsheets online that people can't get access to, and bring all of that data together, complement it with lots of citizen science data from people like Peter who go out and monitor their local river, to provide really big data and a really kind of detailed understanding of what's going on in each catchment and at a strategic level. It's really important for us to be able to monitor, you know, how our interventions are working to drive greater consensus. You know, if you go to any meeting about rivers, everyone's got a different idea about what the problem is. But if we can have data, then we can hopefully move forward to developing consensus about solutions. And that requires having a really effective governance system in place. First off is fair and effective regulation, which, you know, is too often absent, particularly with regard to agriculture, where, you know, there's very few prosecutions taken for the widespread breaches of rules. But, you know, there have also been big problems with the regulation of the water industry, which may or may not be being sorted out. But I think key to this is having a decision-making structure and having local catchment partnerships who can plan what should be going on in their local area, but a level above that, a kind of regional scale body, whether that's an existing body repurposed or a new one, to make those big decisions and bring together multiple sources of funding. And then There are many plans at the moment, many of which don't get implemented. We need to simplify those and synchronize them, so that everyone understands what's actually going to be done, and then they can work together to deliver it. And finally, sustainable finance. And we heard a lot at our conference over the last 2 days about the creation of catchment markets, which I think is a really exciting area. I haven't got time to go into it. You know, bringing together multiple sources of funding to develop really big solutions at scale, which benefit everyone. And it's the people who are willing and able to pay who all chip in a small amount to that, de-risking projects for individual funders. All of that is dependent on good data and governance in order to drive that sustainable finance. So that's all from me. Sorry, I've overrun slightly. There's a link to the State of Our Rivers report if you want to have a look at it, and I really look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Perfect. Thank you, Mark, and thank you for indulging me to prove that this is a live webinar when things went a little bit Pete Tong. But I'm not touching the mouse, and I'll hand over to Daniel to let us know what we've been doing and what we're planning to do to move things forward under the government's realm. Thank you, Mark.
Thanks,
Daniel.
Thanks, Peter. Yeah, thanks, Mark. And I think it's ideal to be following you, to be honest. So yeah, as Peter introduced me as the new managing director, first of all, at Water Resources East. So we're the independent, not-for-profit membership organisation tasked by government primarily to produce a regional water resources management plan through to 2050 and beyond that not only meets the needs of the growing population, but also importantly meets the need of agriculture, industry, energy, and actually the environment. So the biggest driver of future water resources needs by 2050 is to leave more water in the environment for nature for exactly the reasons that Mark sets out, because in many cases it's the flows or the lack of flows at particular times of year is one of the kind of primary reasons why rivers are failing against that good ecological status. I'm not going to spend too much time, certainly in my presentation, talking about it, but Water Resources East has also got some really interesting flagship projects underway, working within individual catchments, looking for how nature-based solutions can help resolve the kind of combined impacts of climate change through both water resources and flood risk management. And as Mark mentioned, after yesterday's announcement under the Environment Act, introducing nutrient neutrality requirements on new developments in a much larger kind of proportion of the country, including in parts of Norfolk, I think there's a real role for Water Resources East to be thinking about how we help deliver nutrient neutrality alongside more water resources in the environment as part of potentially even delivering kind of local nature recovery strategies. So it really is an exciting time, but lots of policies coming forward from government, lots of fast-moving developments to keep pace with, and lots of opportunities for both Water Resources East, the Rivers Trust, the Stormwater Shepherds, and everyone else working in this arena. My slides did move on. So yeah, the kind of the background, I guess, to my involvement in this actually came in my previous role when I was head of public affairs at Anglian Water, obviously being quite closely involved in some of the debates with MPs and in Parliament around the final stages of the Environment Act. If you cast your mind back to September, October, November last year, the Environment Bill was going through Parliament, and basically the biggest kind of barrier to the Act being passed was because of storm overflows and river water health. Mark and Joe and the other kind of campaigners in this area did an absolutely fantastic job to bring river water health right up the political agenda. And there was, it was a huge story when the government was defeated several times in the House of Lords over the Duke of Wellington's amendment, which would have imposed requirements on water companies to progressively tackle storm overflows. But there was a sense of triumph, I think, amongst river health campaigners when essentially the government backed down, introduced its own amendment, and the Act passed into law, which again requires water companies to progressively reduce harm. But that in no way by itself, unfortunately, will lead to river health, rivers returning to good ecological status anytime soon, again for the reasons that Mark has set out, that storm overflows, whilst very visible, are often the kind of final straw in our struggling river systems. And even if you were to stop all storm overflows overnight, then many rivers would still be in a pretty poor state. As the next slide will show. Again, I've lost my control. So there we go. So this is a kind of a different cut of the same data, I think, that Mark was showing. And on the right-hand side, you can see a kind of exploded pie chart, which breaks down the reasons why rivers across England are failing that good ecological status. So what you have is a whole series of what they call reasons for not achieving good, so RNAGs. Lots and lots of them by water body, presented by the Environment Agency as part of their Catchment Data Explorer. And if you drill into the detail, as Mark was explaining, that agriculture is the largest source of reasons for not achieving good. And then if you break it down into nutrient management, land drainage, there's lots of reasons within the agriculture and rural land management sector why rivers are being impacted. And the water sector is the second largest kind of a contributor towards poor water health. And storm overflow, so the issue that became such a political hot potato back last autumn, only accounts for 4% of the reasons why rivers are failing good health. And if you remove those 4% of reasons, most of the rivers impacted will still be impacted by something else as well. And of course, you need to remove all the reasons why rivers are failing for any particular water body to jump back up to good status. So it's a one-out, all-out system under river basin management plans and the Water Framework Directive. In the east of England, actually, storm overflows only account for 1% of reasons why rivers are failing good ecological health. So absolutely, storm overflows need to be tackled, but it's the first step and certainly not the last step in the action that needs to take place. If you move on to the next slide for me, because one of the challenges in tackling storm overflows is their costs. And this is quite a complicated chart, which I'll just spend a few minutes kind of talking you through, but it's the critical one because I suspect this is the one that's ministers, DEFRA, and particularly Ofwat have been mulling over the last couple of months as they prepare to publish the draft storm overflows action plan, probably within the next month or so. Because what we're trying to do across the x-axis is to reduce as far as possible the average number of spills per storm overflow per year. So storm overflows at the moment might in some cases be spilling hundreds of times per year, but the 40, the 20, the 10 through to 0 is the average number of spills that you want to set as a kind of national target. And of course, the fewer spills, the more expensive it gets to achieve it. And then within each kind of F40 is 40 spills per year. You've got a low and a high range in terms of costs. And then if you look at the colors, the three kind of bars within each area, you've got three different ways of achieving that level of performance. The blue is basically using downstream storm tanks, so more storage downstream within the system, so there's more buffer to be used up when the rain falls before the storm overflow systems trigger. You could adopt at least at some sustainable drainage systems, some suds, so 10% suds would start to increase the cost. If you go for a kind of heavy suds approach, of course, you increase the costs even further with the grey bars. And in terms of where you want to get to towards the right-hand side, as you can see the costs become increasingly expensive if you want to get to anything like 0 spills per year. And to put that into context, if you want to get to 0 spills per year, you're in a sense, well, overall, essentially looking to double the average household water bill. The average household water bill is about £400 per year. And if you get to 0 spills, you're looking to between, say, 160 to 250 billion pounds, which works out per household as towards kind of 3 to 350 pounds per year. The Thames Tideway Tunnel, which of course was a single significant infrastructure investment within London to prevent storm overflows within the Thames area, that itself is £5 billion and adding about £20–25 to the average bill. So that really shows you the scale of the investment that might be needed in order to reduce storm overflows down to 0. And of course, as a reminder, these are only 4% of the reasons why rivers are failing good health. That's not to say that nothing should be done. Of course it should. We should absolutely reduce and remove storm overflows as far as possible. But this is the conundrum that ministers are faced. How much more do they want to add to bills in order to resolve this as a problem? And I guess the real kicker is that none of these options, none of these targets in terms of storm overflows deliver benefits in excess of costs. So these options just are not cost effective. None of them are cost effective. And under the usual Treasury guidance, that means that ministers should be directed toward doing the minimum that's necessary to meet statutory requirements. And what are the statutory requirements? Well, in essence, there aren't really any nailed on firm statutory requirements to be met in this case. The Environment Act ended up with that language that we all debated back at last autumn about progressively reducing harm, reducing the adverse impacts of storm overflows over time, but it didn't set a target. The strategic policy statements that DEFRA published in February, that didn't set a target. And so we await the Storm Overflows Action Plan next month to see whether that might put a line in the sand and set a target at that stage. So moving on to the next slide, because as I say, there are different ways in which we could achieve whatever target that you might want to set. Storm overflow tanks, and if you move on to the next slide, or sustainable drainage systems. So, this is a slightly leading slide because clearly my preference, and I think it's clear from Mark's slides that his preference would be to, as far as possible, achieve whatever target you want to set through use of upstream green nature-based solutions, green infrastructure that may cost you a little bit more, but actually it might cost bill payers less if you can kind of leverage the multi-functional benefits that SUDS deliver within the urban environment to get funding from local authorities, to get funding for the carbon benefits potentially they deliver, funding for the biodiversity benefits they deliver, funding for the water resource benefits as well as the water quality benefits. So even though the price tag might be higher, the cost to either the taxpayer or the water company bill payer might well be less. And as an example of where that's being done strategically, again on my next slide, I've stolen this from my old employer Anglian Water, where they did a systematic review in this small town of March in the Cambridgeshire Fens, looking at where the foul water system was being overloaded by too much rainwater being connected from within the urban environment. So essentially, even though it's only supposed to be a foul water system, there were lots of individual highways, gullies, downpipes and other connections going into that foul water system and causing it to overflow even in quite minimal rainfall conditions. And just the blowout there, this is partly sponsored in partnership with the local district council, and there was a slightly awkward meeting where we had to explain to them that their building, highlighted in red in that blowout, was actually one of the primary causes of surface water entering the foul water network. So in total, 24 hectares of impermeable area misconnected, incorrectly connected to the foul water system was identified. And on the next slide, happily, Anglian Water was able to identify 24 hectares of potential ways to reduce that rainwater getting into the system. So rainwater gardens, water butts, swales, filter drains, so it all added up to about 24 hectares. And if you go to the next slide, I'll finish just by talking about the other things that I mentioned in my blog back in November as things beyond storm overflows that need to be done in policy terms if we're going to make a difference. One of the first things that I was keen to do when I appeared before the Environmental Audit Committee last May with Joe and several others was to promote the need to ban wet pipes containing plastic. So most wet pipes contain plastic fibres, they don't break down the environment, and then not only the cause of environmental destruction once they get into rivers and our oceans, they are the cause themselves of those sewer overflow pipes discharging, because they clog up the system like cholesterol, they foul pumps and impellers, causing sewer overflows in the first place. And so we're really pleased that DEFRA launched a call for evidence back in November to call for evidence to whether wet wipes containing plastic should be banned, and that's a campaign that's been picked up by Fleur Anderson in her private members bill since. Obviously, since the blog, we've also had the Environmental Audit Committee's report itself, and we should within a few weeks see the government's response to that. And they made a really strong series of recommendations, not just about sewer overflows, but also about farming, about highways, and about other aspects of river health that need to be improved and how that can be strengthened. DEFRA did come out eventually with its strategic policy statement earlier, actually I think it was in February rather than March, and did strengthen it based on the draft that was published last year. but as I said, still stops short of setting any kind of target for how much water companies need to do by 2030, which is the end of the next price review period, to help tackle river health and to reduce storm overflows. As Mark mentioned, Anglian Water and Severn Trent Water came out this week with their own plan, which on the face of it looks, well, incredibly ambitious, because what it says is that by 2030, neither company will account for any reasons for not achieving good within their catchments. So not just that, it seems that it's not just that 4% of storm overflows will be tackled, but also where phosphorus, in particular phosphates, are causing rivers to have too high a nutrient load. And also the other kind of point in here actually happened yesterday, where DEFRA did at least propose statutory targets for improving river water health. But unfortunately, the water consumption target was very weak. It's based on per capita, and because population growth is happening, then the 20% reduction per capita means that we could still be taking more water out of the environment in future than we are today. And the targets on water quality only pinpoint individual pollutants and nutrients rather than target river health overall. So we all still are waiting for the Storm Overflows Action Plan that should be out in the next month or so. And of course, hopefully, when we look ahead to the August and September, the government will announce the results of its review of Schedule 3 of the Floodwater Management Act, which has been sitting there on ice for the last 10 years since the Floodwater Management Act was passed. And what that would do is stop new development adding additional pressure to the existing sewage system. So it stopped developers automatically connecting downpipes and other drainage features to sewers, even if they're already overloaded. It would apply mandatory SUDS design standards within new development, and it will also resolve adoption maintenance requirements. So it's something that many witnesses, including Joe and I, to the Environmental Law Committee, said was one of the most significant and important things that the government can do, and now is the time to remove that automatic right to connect. So I'll leave it there, Peter. Again, I probably went on too long, but there's lots to say. Oh, and that's a picture of my little pet green roof. So, you know, I practice what I preach. It's a small green roof. I love it. It's it changes during the course of the seasons, and I thoroughly recommend you installing one if you can.
100%. Thank you, Daniel. That was fascinating and really much appreciated. So, without further ado, Joe, do you want to try and run the slideshow? Or there we go. Perfect.
Is that you or me, Pete? Do you know?
That's you. Yeah.
Oh, good. I'm in charge. Jolly good. Thank you, Daniel and Mark. That was always eye-opening and interesting. Interestingly for me, that image that Daniel just showed of the concentric circles with the reasons for not achieving good, the transport reason in there is so small it doesn't even have its own segment in the chart. It's one of the others marked with an asterisk. So think on that as I do my presentation. Give me, I've muted myself again. So I just I'm going to talk about bringing rivers back to health, focusing particularly on urban runoff, as you might imagine. So there are 4 things I think we need to do to bring rivers back to good health, most of which have been spoken about. Reducing sewer overflows to a level that rivers can tolerate. And I spend a lot of time reminding people that we can't eliminate all sewer overflows. That would be madness. There is a capacity within our river network to tolerate some pollution, and we should remember that. Reducing agricultural pollution, restoring and protecting river flows, which I'll mention in a minute, and then managing stormwater and funding that management. I'm not going to touch on morphology, temperature and other things today because we haven't got time. And I am aware that there are lots of other sources of pollution. I'm just not going to include them today. So I will focus on stormwater management, but I just wanted to say a quick word about flow restoration, just because this is something that keeps me awake at night a little bit. This was an image that was knocking around last summer of a sudden loss in water level, allegedly due to a development in North Stowe, where they were dewatering a site for residential development, and the ponds disappeared in Long Stanton in quite a short time frame, and it got lots of press coverage, and local people were upset and agitated, rightly so. And we see a lot of this. We see this with chalk streams as well. And there's always a lot of talk about water supply and aquatic life, but I just want to give a shout out for creatures like this, because this little hedgehog died during the first lockdown when we had that, do you remember that hot sunny spell that we were all very grateful for? This little hedgehog died during that time just of hunger and thirst, simply because it couldn't get access to enough food and water in the British countryside. And we've got to remember that. We've got to remember that we focus on river health, we focus on aesthetics for people, but we've got to remember that all wildlife is entitled to have access to fresh water. And if the rivers dry up, these guys, all terrestrial mammals and many birds, simply don't have access to water, and we should remember that. And suds design, when you're doing suds designs, those of you who are on the call who are engineers, remember that water features shouldn't be about fountains and splash zones for children to play in and aesthetically pleasing stone things with water trickling down them. It shouldn't just be about the humans and the aesthetics. Remember to try and include some surface level water for wildlife as well. Rant over, but it's something I'm really passionate about. So stormwater management, which is what I'm supposed to be talking about. You know, I guess everybody on this call, that all urban surfaces carry pollutants. This is an outfall off a motorway into a river near Chorley, near where I live. If I were to sample that in any rain event, it would be causing gross pollution. But not just that, runoff like that goes into our combined sewers across this country when it rains, and it shouldn't. It's what we used to call top water when I worked on the farm. It should go into the river and into the water environment, and it shouldn't go into our sewers. And near where I live, we have steep-sided river valleys running down off the moors and the fells into towns and villages. And historically, there was a tendency to put that top water, as it comes down off the fell, sometimes it would be put into the sewer, simply because it was the easy thing to do. And that's something that we really need to unpick, because putting fresh, clean surface water into sewers makes no sense. But putting urban runoff like that into sewers makes no sense. So we've got an opportunity to take direct discharges of stormwater and treat them, but also to take stormwater out of sewers and to treat it and put it back into the water environment. Little rant there about motorways and trunk roads, because they are my life and they do cause some of the worst pollution of stormwater. But part of the reason why transport was such a little teeny weeny bit on that chart that Daniel showed was there is no data. For various reasons dating back to the Dangerous Substances Directive, the Environment Agency don't monitor most watercourses for polyaromatic hydrocarbons, because the Dangerous Substances Directive didn't require them to do so. And so when they transcribed or transposed that directive into the Environmental Quality Standards Directive, they still don't measure for polyaromatic hydrocarbons where there are discharges of road runoff. So we don't measure this pollution. And when we measure metals, which is another pollutant in road runoff, we tend to do it at the bottom of the catchment, and then it's impossible to say where it comes from. And microplastics is a whole new ball game. So there is a massive amount of microplastic in road runoff discharges like that. Probably one of the biggest terrestrial sources of microplastics is tyre wear particles in road runoff, but we have no measure of it, and we have no real knowledge of the extent of it, but we do know it causes pollution. So how does this all affect river health? So polyaromatic hydrocarbons, which I mentioned, include something called benzoapyrene, and benzoapyrene is carcinogenic. It's a substance of very high concern under the REACH regulations, partly because it is so carcinogenic. We have no idea what that means for river swimmers. So if you're river swimming downstream of a discharge from a heavily trafficked road, we have no idea what the impact of that benzoapyrene is having on you as a swimmer. And that worries me. But what worries me probably more than that is the impact that those toxins are having on the things that live in the river. Because the entire aquatic ecosystem is affected by these toxic pollutants. And I kind of feel like the aquatic ecosystem should come first. And I did a presentation recently where I did a plea really to shift the balance back to consider the aquatic ecosystem perhaps before we consider river swimmers, because the river swimming agenda is shoving us down the route of controlling fecal indicator organisms in rivers, because they're what make you poorly. But actually, we're not looking at toxic pollutants, and we should be. So when we talk about river health, I think it's really important to remember what we mean. And as far as I'm concerned, we mean the health of the organisms that live in the river. And we need to remember that. This is a slightly nerdy slide, and I'm not going to apologise, but it's fascinating, and this is why I get so wound up about this. So this, and I'm no scientist, so don't ask me any technical questions, but this is the impact of polyaromatic hydrocarbons on that river ecosystem. So this image shows the impact of 4-oxyhydroxy, I know I'm going to get I get this wrong, hydroxybenzoatrazine, I think it is. And that's the impact it has on the spicule in the embryo of a sea urchin. Now, like I say, I don't know anything about that. The point is, these chemicals impact these microscopic organisms at a sublethal level. So they affect their formation, they affect their ability to reproduce, they affect their ability to thrive, they affect their ability to eat. They cause this nasty, insidious harm to the development of the species, so they can't thrive. And that goes across very many species in an aquatic environment. So these are teeny weeny, but if you look at the microscopic fungi in the sediment of a watercourse, polyaromatic hydrocarbons affect those too. Now, those guys are the things that break down the organic matter in the bed of the watercourse, so the leaf matter that falls in. They release the organic nutrients into soluble form so that then the microscopic flora and fauna in the water column can eat that, and then they're eaten in turn by the invertebrates, and they're eaten in turn by the fish and the otters and who knows. The point is that these poisons affect the whole ecosystem. So they affect the microscopic fungi, but they also affect the invertebrates, and then they go on to affect everything up the food chain. So we're just ignoring this pollution. There's very little measure of it. There's very little recognition of it. I'm desperate for somebody to do a PhD on the entire impact on the ecosystem. And this is going on every day. And we stand around and throw our arms up in horror and say, why are our rivers not getting cleaner? Why are our fish populations not improving? Why is it that our rivers always come up with poor fish results when we do the fisheries surveys? And I think this is a massive reason. And I think this should be right up there with sewage pollution and agricultural pollution. But it's not, because we haven't got the data. But we can deal with it. I'm not going to be Mrs. Doom and Gloom in Preston as I normally am. We can fix this. We've got an array of treatment devices that will fix this pollution. So mostly suds devices, but also some manufactured devices that will catch that pollution and take it out of the river environment. So this image is the sludge taken from the bottom of a vortex grit separator in Wigan. I live a very luxurious life. So we took these samples, we took this sludge out of the bottom of the vortex grit separator and actually took it to a treatment plant, which is where we got this photograph. But if you imagine that sludge is stuffed full of microplastics, toxic metals, and toxic organic compounds, and that would have gone in the river. And there are estimates knocking about, but take 1 tonne per hectare per year as a kind of guesstimate. For every catchment you work on and every river you work on and every design you do, there is tons of that stuff going in the river every year. And it's poisonous, and it's carcinogenic, and it's bioaccumulative, and it's mutagenic. And we're just not giving it the attention it deserves. But we can fix it, because that device had caught about 5 tons of that sludge. So we've got to do this, and we can do it. So retrofitting suds is the answer. Retrofitting suds will reduce CSO spills, but it will also treat urban pollution before it goes into the water environment. And you know, and we know, that retrofit suds like that one in the image there are fantastic, and they deliver multiple benefits, and they deliver habitats for wildlife and do all those things. But it's not cheap. You know, Daniel put a slide up before showing those huge amounts of money. I would argue that if the lovely people of London have had their, what is it, 400 billion Thames Tideway tunnel, then why can't the rest of the country have the same sort of infrastructure, please? But I would have it as suds, not as concrete tunnels. But where's that money going to come from? Is it going to go on our water bills, or is it going to go somewhere else, or come from somewhere else? So something Stormwater Shepherds is focusing on at the moment, and I've done a whole presentation on this, but I've condensed it to one slide. We don't know where this money is going to come from. If Schedule 3 is enacted and the water companies become the suds approval bodies, then theoretically Ofwat will allow the water companies to increase household bills to pay for stormwater management, stormwater maintenance, stormwater operation, and that would be good. Couple of problems in there, but we'll not talk about those today. Alternatively, you could introduce a whole new stormwater levy that would go alongside your council tax, and we would create a department in every council who were stormwater managers, which they've done in some states in America, and it works really well, and it creates jobs for local people. So that's an option. National highways have some money, we just need to get it out of them to spend on retrofit drainage. But whatever we do, it needs to be equitable. And whatever we do, it needs to be sustainable, because these things need maintaining. That vortex separator needs emptying, that pond needs desludging every 20 years, the vegetation needs removing in the autumn. We must maintain these devices, and we need loads of money. That's it. Just a plea for money, really. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you, Joe. I think the three presentations really complemented each other so well. So I'd like to thank each of you for such excellent presentations and all the hard work that goes into creating these in the first place. It's not just a sort of 10 or 15 minute slot, it's hours of work that you've put in. So I really appreciate it on behalf of all the audience. There's a couple of areas. We've got about 4 or 5 minutes. So there are two kind of key areas that I thought would be worth exploring and just ask the question of the panel. I'm thinking at the corporate level and then down at grassroots, at sort of local community level. So the first question that I've got in my mind, I was scribbling down some notes, is the attitude. So based on your experience, if I go to Mark and then Daniel and then Joe, but based on your experiences, what's the kind of attitude of the landowners and the farmers towards wanting to sort of clean up the rivers, and the water companies, maybe the highways authorities? And the fourth thought that's crept into my head is the pharmaceutical industry, where the wastewater treatment plants can't treat all of the prescribed drugs that are getting flushed through the system. So we're now starting to get this invisible kind of poisoning, if you like, of ibuprofens and all sorts of things getting into our river network. So basically, at the high level, what would your experience be on the attitude of those like landowners and farmers, the water companies, the highways authorities towards helping to clean up our river systems? Mark, do you want to have a mention?
I'll be as brief as possible, but I mean, I think that in general, I mean, there's a huge shift going on. I sense that there's something really positive happening. There's a huge shift in attitudes. There are, you know, a very large number of people very keen to play a positive role in dealing with the climate and biodiversity emergencies, and they kind of sense the urgency. They realize that radical solutions are required. There are lots of people who just want to carry on doing what they've always done, including, you know, individuals within companies who haven't changed. And there's a lag, I think, in terms of the regulatory system. We've got a regulatory system designed for hard engineering rather than for, you know, a new world of nature-based solutions. And we haven't yet, as I said, you know, developed the systems for people to collaborate to bring down the cost of those interventions by, you know, getting lots of people to team up together. We're developing them. So I think there's a lot of progress. I think the pharmaceutical thing is really interesting. I had a meeting at the end of yesterday after our conference with a group, and we were exploring the potential for pharmaceutical companies to have kind of producer responsibility and to actually, you know, they do have very big money. If you could bring some of that to bear to put in wetlands on every, you know, effluent pipe and overflow, you know, ultimately these things come from big pharma, and big pharma should pay for the cleanup. So I think that's an interesting avenue to explore, and one that we're going to be looking at.
Great, thank you, Mark. Daniel, how was your experience with Anglian as well? Because I do feel like the farmers and the water companies are really doing their best, and you know, they've got to.
Well, that's my sense. And I just, from the water industry perspective, I think yeah, every water company absolutely gets this, that, you know, river health has been too long, the kind of poor relation, lots of investment in the past in water treatment, so drinking water quality, not enough investment in the past, not enough focus by, to be honest, top down from government, from regulators, as well as water companies, in sorting out wastewater treatment and levels of nutrients, storm overflows going into rivers. But yeah, the announcement this week by Severn Trent and Anglian is saying, you know, really quite significant. And you know, it's why all water companies supported the Duke of Wellington Amendment last autumn, and water companies, including Anglian, really wanted a very clear statement of priorities from DEFRA about what investment needs to achieve by 2030. Just on chemicals, chemical approval, one of the issues that caused the metaldehyde issue in water bodies was that there was no assessment of water treatability for new chemicals and actives being approved for use on fields and in farms. So metaldehyde was approved, and it was only later discovered that it was getting into water bodies and it was incredibly expensive to remove. And as far as I know, that is still the problem. So you could still be having chemicals and other actives being approved today that will cause long-term water quality problems downstream.
And many of them not even being monitored.
Yeah. It was like metaldehyde popped up on one of our chemical, we weren't looking for it, we found it, and it's like, oh, what's this? And then that caused, all kinds of different things to be done. And thankfully now metaldehyde, for outdoor use, is being banned.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. Joe, I mean, you had lots of experience with the Environment Agency in dealing with Highways England, which are now national highways, and landowners and farmers and what have you. What's your experience? And then I'm going to have to hand over back to Ben. I would love this to carry on all afternoon. But yeah, Joe, do you want to pick up on the attitude?
Thanks, Pete. The farming thing, it's a long time since I've been involved in working with farmers, but I passionately believe that working with farmers is the way, and not beating them with a shitty stick, which I saw something yesterday about increased regulation of farmers, and I find that it breaks my heart really, because most farmers want to do it right. They just, A, they can't afford it, and B, they don't know how. And we historically had a really good regime of visiting farmers and helping them, and that's just gone by the by. So I would bring that back. Farmers really interesting, actually. In my longer presentation on stormwater levies, I suggest that the pharmaceutical manufacturers should contribute to the cost of stormwater treatment, but it always seems to fall on rather stony ground. But if they're causing part of the problem, why shouldn't they pay for part of the solution? But yeah, and probably highway authorities, I have a very mixed response from highway authorities, and probably least said, soonest mended, I think. There are lots of really good questions in the question and answer, Pete. So can we answer those offline? Is that okay?
I was going to say that I don't touch the button and mess up the presentation again. So I haven't accessed all the questions, and I really enjoyed your presentation so much. I didn't want to hurry anyone along because it's just priceless. And I know we've run out of time, but we can retrospectively answer those questions, and maybe even run another session, because I just think creating this awareness is only going to be doing good at a community level, as well as a sort of larger scale level. So the way that the big takeaways I'm getting is that we really need to be, for all those consultants out there working on new developments, you need to put nature and water at the heart of everything that we do, whether you're working on new developments or whether we can retrofit and do great things like Daniel's green roof. And if we all did that, what a difference that would make. You can imagine the benefits, the multiple benefits that would provide. Data really key to understand what's happening. So we know a lot. I think there's an awful lot that we don't know, that's kind of bubbling up and building up on our riverbeds that we need to be more aware of and be upfront about, and then we can come up with some solutions. We've certainly got the technology, and we've got the right momentum. I really feel a positivity that's coming through from government top down, all the way through across the whole of the region, Europe, Middle East, and Africa, that I cover. It's a very positive step that we're all taking forward. And then the governments and the money, this is the thing. I'm not sure whether we've got enough regulation. I kind of feel that we do, but that last step, that Schedule 3 that Daniel mentioned, is absolutely critical, and the right to connect, because I think the poor old water companies have been beaten up and had their hands tied behind their backs there. So yeah, I think we're almost there, but still a few things to do. But Joe, Daniel, Mark, I really appreciate all of your contributions on behalf of the audience. And at that, I'll hand over to Tom, to Ben, and thank you all for your questions that I'm afraid we'll have to sort of pick up and send out to you.
Excellent
Get
stuff.
involved, folks. Yeah, just encourage you all. Get involved with your local Rivers Trust, get involved with Stormwater Shepherds, or even just get out there and do a little plastic pollution survey with an app from the River Watch. But yeah, get actively involved. And if you need any help, just drop me an email and I'll steer you in the right direction. Ben.
Excellent stuff. Thank you. A big thank you to our experts, Joe, Daniel, Mark. and our resident host, Peter, for an excellent water talk today. We have an exciting programme of webinars scheduled for the coming weeks, so I'll be updating you about them, as well as sharing a recording of this webinar next week. Please also remember to complete the short survey that follows this webinar. In return, you'll receive an attendance certificate you can use as proof of professional development. These certificates will be sent from GoToWebinar in 5 days' time. As always, don't forget to check out our upcoming training courses and visit our website for more details about them. And finally, a big thank you for joining us today. Have a great St. Patrick's Day, everyone.